I set down my coffee mug and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The maple tree I'd planted the year my daughter was born had grown tall enough now to shade most of the yard in the afternoon. 34 years of growth. I'd watched that tree the same way I'd watched her, slowly, steadily, with a kind of quiet pride that doesn't need an audience. My name is Walter Kowalski. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working as an electrical inspector for the city of Ottawa, and I retired 3 years ago with a pension, a handshake from my supervisor, and absolutely no regrets. My wife, Patricia, passed away 6 years ago from ovarian cancer. It was the hardest thing I've ever lived through, and some days it still is. But she left me with our daughter, Megan, and that has always been enough to keep going. Megan is 32 now. She has her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which is either a blessing or a problem, depending on the day. She works as a physiotherapist at a clinic in Canada, and she is without question or bias one of the most genuinely kind people I have ever known. She volunteers on weekends. She calls me every Tuesday and Thursday without fail. She drove 2 hours in a February snowstorm to help me when my furnace broke down, and she didn't complain once. When she told me she was seeing someone seriously, I was glad. When she told me his name was Ryan Ashworth, and that his family was, in her words, pretty well off, I nodded and asked whether he made her laugh. She said yes. That was enough for me. I met Ryan for the first time at a dinner in late October. He was polite, a little stiff in the way that people are when they're trying to make a good impression, but genuine underneath it. He worked in commercial real estate, had good manners, and looked at Megan the way a man should look at someone he loves, like she's the most interesting person in the room. I liked him well enough. I shook his hand and told him I was glad to meet him. His parents were a different matter. I didn't meet Richard and Carolyn Ashworth until the engagement was already official. Megan had been wearing the ring for 3 weeks when the two families were introduced at a restaurant in Westboro, a place I later found out cost more per person than I used to spend on groceries in a week. I wore my good blazer. I'd had my hair cut the day before. I drove downtown and found parking 2 blocks away and walked in the January cold because I didn't want to arrive flustered. Richard Ashworth was the kind of man who fills a room by deciding to. He was tall, silver-haired, with the particular confidence of someone who has never had to wonder whether the bill would clear. He ran a commercial development company that had projects across Ontario and into Alberta, and he had the handshake of a man who considers every greeting a transaction. His wife, Carolyn, was elegant in the way that comes from decades of practice, every gesture precise, every smile measured. They were pleasant enough that evening. Courteous. They asked about my career, and when I explained that I'd spent my working years as a city electrical inspector, Richard nodded slowly in the way people do when they're filing information away, rather than actually listening to it. Carolyn smiled and said, "That must have been very steady work." I told her it was. I didn't take offense. I've been around long enough to recognize the particular kind of condescension that wears the costume of politeness. I simply noted it and moved on. Megan squeezed my hand under the table at one point. She'd noticed, too. The engagement shower was planned for the last Saturday of March. Megan had wanted something small, close friends, both families, maybe 40 people at most. Carolyn Ashworth had offered to host it at their property in Manotick, a house that, when I pulled up the long gravel driveway, looked less like a home and more like a statement. Stone facade, 3-car garage, the kind of landscaping that requires a professional team to maintain. I parked my 7-year-old Civic between a Land Rover and a Mercedes and reminded myself that the people inside were just people. It was a Saturday afternoon in late March, still cold enough for a coat but with that thin, particular light that tells you winter is finally thinking about leaving. The inside of the house was immaculate, catered food on long tables, flower arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly utilities, staff moving quietly between guests with trays of champagne. I accepted a glass because it seemed rude not to. I found Megan almost immediately. She was standing near the fireplace talking to a group of her friends, and she lit up when she saw me, crossing the room to hug me. She looked happy. She looked beautiful. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that had been her mother's favorite color, and her hair was pinned up, and I thought for just a moment about Patricia, about how much she would have loved to be in this room. I steadied myself and went to say hello to Ryan, who was good-natured and clearly a little overwhelmed by the size of the event his mother had organized. He pulled me into a handshake that turned into a brief, genuine hug, and he said, "I'm really glad you're here, Walter." I told him likewise, and meant it. The afternoon moved along pleasantly enough for the first hour and a half. I spoke with some of Megan's friends from university, a couple of her colleagues from the clinic. I had a good conversation with Ryan's uncle, a retired school principal from Kingston, who turned out to have opinions about hockey that I could respect. I ate something with smoked salmon on it, and decided it was genuinely excellent. Then Richard Ashworth tapped his champagne glass. He was standing in the center of the main sitting room, and the gesture fork against crystal had the practiced ease of a man accustomed to having rooms quiet for him, which this one did almost immediately. He smiled the smile of someone who has prepared remarks. "I want to take a moment," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "to welcome everyone here today and to celebrate this wonderful occasion. Ryan is our son, and watching him grow into the man he is has been the greatest pride of our lives." He paused. Carolyn smiled from her chair. "And of course, we're welcoming Megan into our family, which is an adjustment for everyone, naturally." I noticed the word adjustment. I kept my expression neutral. "Megan comes from a different background than our family," Richard continued, and his tone was still warm, still wearing the costume of a toast. But there was something underneath it shifting, like ice in April. "She's a lovely girl, warm, caring. Ryan clearly adores her, and she's been making efforts, real efforts, to familiarize herself with some of the aspects of our lifestyle. The social commitments, the charitable work, the expectations that come with being part of a family with our kind of profile." He smiled again. The room had gone to a specific kind of quiet that I recognized. It was the quiet of people who sense something uncomfortable is happening but haven't decided yet how to respond. "She has a good heart," Richard said. "She'll learn. These things take time. Coming from where she does, it's understandable that some of the polish is still coming." He lifted his glass slightly. "We're patient people. We look forward to the journey. To Ryan and Megan." Glasses went up around the room. People drank. Megan did not move. I could see her from where I stood near the far wall. Her face had gone carefully, deliberately still, the expression of someone using every resource they have to not let a room full of people see what's happening inside them. Ryan was beside her, and his jaw was tight, and he was staring at his father with an expression I couldn't quite read. I set my champagne glass down on the nearest surface. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment, because it was not rage. It was not the hot, immediate kind of anger that makes you do foolish things. It was something colder and more deliberate. It was 32 years of raising a daughter alone after her mother got sick, of working overtime shifts so she could go to university without debt, of watching her study for her licensing exams at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, of sitting with her through her mother's final weeks, and watching her hold it together when I could barely hold myself together. All of that compressed into a single, quiet, absolute clarity. He had just stood in front of 40 people, in his own home, at a party meant to celebrate my daughter, and told her that she was a project, that she was unfinished, that she was lucky to be tolerated. I waited until the brief applause had died. I waited until Richard had lowered his glass and was beginning to accept congratulations from the couple nearest him. Then I crossed the room. I did not raise my voice. I have never needed to. "Richard," I said. He turned, pleasantly enough. He'd probably already moved on from the toast in his own mind. "Walter, glad you could make it." "I'd like a word," I said. "Outside, if you don't mind." Something in my tone registered. His smile stayed in place, but his eyes recalibrated slightly. "Of course," he said. We stepped through the French doors onto the stone terrace at the back of the house. It was cold. Neither of us had coats. The remnants of a late-season snow still sat in the shadowed corners of the yard. A catering staff member glanced at us and then looked away. Richard turned to face me with the posture of a man who expects to manage whatever is about to happen. "That speech," I said. "I thought it was quite warm," he said. "You told a room full of people that my daughter lacks polish, that she's an adjustment, that your family is doing her a favor by being patient with her." I paused. "At her own engagement shower." He tilted his head slightly. "I think you may be reading into it, Walter. It was a toast. These things... I spent 31 years as a city electrical inspector," I said. "You know what that job requires? It requires knowing exactly what's up to code and what isn't. And what you said in there was not up to code." He let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal. I understand you're protective of your daughter. That's natural. But Walter, the reality is that Megan is entering a life that's quite different from what she grew up with. I didn't say anything that wasn't true. There are expectations. Let me tell you something about my daughter, I said, and my voice was very quiet now, the way it gets when I'm absolutely certain of what I'm saying. She graduated top of her physiotherapy cohort at the University of Ottawa. She has been providing care to patients, including elderly patients, veterans, people recovering from strokes for 8 years. She organized a fundraiser last fall that raised $40,000 for the Ottawa Food Bank. She sat beside her dying mother for 6 weeks and held her hand every single day. And she never once fell apart, because she knew her mother needed her to be strong. Richard was watching me now with a slightly different expression, less managed. She is the finest person I know, I said. And you stood in your sitting room and told 40 people that she needs work, that she's a fixer-upper, in front of her colleagues, her friends, and the man she's going to marry. I didn't say. You said exactly that, I said. You dressed it up, but that was the substance of it. And I need you to understand something very clearly. I looked at him steadily. I know who you are, Richard. Not just the profile, the actual record. He went still. I had known Richard Ashworth by name for longer than he realized. Not personally, but professionally. In my last 4 years before retirement, I'd been seconded to a joint municipal review panel examining commercial construction compliance across Ottawa and the surrounding region. It was quiet, procedural work, the kind that doesn't make headlines. But I had reviewed documentation. I had seen inspection logs and variance requests, and the particular paper trail that develops when a development company is in the habit of cutting corners on electrical and fire suppression systems in their commercial builds, and then filing amended reports after the fact to cover it. I had flagged 2 of Ashworth Development's projects in my last year of work. The files had been referred upward. I had retired before the follow-up concluded, but I had kept my notes. I keep meticulous notes. 31 years of habit. 3 days after the engagement was announced, 3 days after Megan told me about Ryan's family, and I had quietly put the surname Ashworth together with the files, I remembered I had made some calls. To a former colleague still working in the compliance division, to another who had moved into the provincial ministry. What I learned was that the review of those files had not concluded. It was still open, and there was now additional material that had been submitted from a whistleblower inside one of the contractor firms that had significantly expanded the scope of the inquiry. I had not told anyone this, not Megan, not Ryan. I had decided to meet the Ashworths with an open mind and to let the present govern itself. Richard Ashworth had just made the present very clear. I spent the last 4 years of my career on a compliance review panel, I said. I reviewed Ashworth development files. Specifically, 2 commercial properties in Gloucester and 1 mixed-use build in Nepean. I flagged discrepancies in the electrical and fire suppression documentation. Those files are still open, Richard. The inquiry is still active, and I still have my notes. The color of Richard Ashworth's face changed in the way that faces do when something that felt very distant suddenly becomes very close. I'm not a vindictive person, I said. I wasn't going to do anything with those notes. I'm retired. It wasn't my business anymore. But you just stood up in front of 40 people and told my daughter, at her own party, that she isn't good enough, that she needs to be improved, that your family is tolerating her. I held his gaze. So now I'm making it my business again. He opened his mouth. I'm going to make a phone call on Monday morning, I said, to my former colleague in the compliance division. I'm going to ask him to pull the files and confirm whether my notes add anything useful to the current inquiry. That's all. I'm not going to call a lawyer. I'm not going to contact the press. I'm not going to do anything dramatic. I'm simply going to do what a retired city inspector with 31 years of service and meticulous records is completely entitled to do. I let that settle. Or, I said, you can go back inside, find my daughter, and apologize to her. Not a managed apology, not a redirect, an actual, genuine, specific apology for what you said in there, and you can do it in front of the same people who heard the original remarks. Richard Ashworth stood on his cold stone terrace and said nothing for a long moment. You wouldn't, he finally said, but his voice had lost its register. Richard, I said, I'm a 64-year-old widower who drove a 2017 Civic to this party and spent the whole first hour talking to a retired principal about the Ottawa Senators. I have absolutely nothing to prove to anyone in that room. But my daughter does not leave this house today carrying what you just put on her. That's not happening. I put my hands in my pockets and waited. He looked at me for another long moment. Then he straightened his jacket, and something shifted in his face, not quite humility, but something in that direction. Something that looked, maybe for the first time, like recognition, like he was seeing a person in front of him rather than a category. He went back inside. I stood on the terrace for another minute, alone in the March cold, looking out at the snow, still tucked into the shadows along the fence line. I thought about Patricia. I thought about what she would have said. She'd have probably told me I was too calm about it, and then she'd have hugged me, and then she'd have gone in to check on Megan. I went back inside. The room had been continuing in its pleasant, muffled way, the way rooms do when an undercurrent isn't visible from all angles. Megan was now standing with Ryan near the window, and Ryan was speaking to her in a low voice, and her expression had shifted from that careful stillness into something more complicated, hurt, and trying to decide what to do with it. Richard Ashworth crossed the room to them. I positioned myself near the edge of the group, close enough to witness, far enough to be unobtrusive. I watched Richard Ashworth look at his son first. Something passed between them that I won't pretend to fully understand. The complicated language of fathers and sons, and then he turned to Megan. "Megan," he said, and his voice was different now. Not the boardroom voice, something quieter. "I owe you an apology. What I said in my remarks earlier was out of line. It was condescending, and it was wrong, and it shouldn't have been said. Certainly not here, and certainly not in front of your friends and family." He paused. "I hope you'll accept my apology." Megan looked at him for a moment. I watched her, my daughter, who has her mother's composure and her own considerable spine, and I watched her decide. "Thank you for saying that," she said, simply and clearly. Not warm, but dignified. She didn't perform forgiveness for the room. She received the apology and filed it honestly. Carolyn had appeared at Richard's shoulder. She placed a hand on Megan's arm and said quietly, "I'm sorry too, sweetheart." And I think that one was entirely genuine. Ryan looked at his father for a long moment after that. Whatever he saw, or whatever he decided, he reached over and took Megan's hand. And he held it, and he didn't let go for the rest of the afternoon. I went and got another glass of sparkling water and returned to the corner where the retired principal from Kingston was standing, and we talked for another 40 minutes about absolutely nothing consequential, and it was one of the more pleasant conversations I'd had in months. I did make a phone call on Monday morning, but not to the compliance division. I called my former supervisor a good man, thorough, fair, and I asked him to confirm whether the Ashworth development files were adequately staffed and whether my archived notes from the flagged inspections were accessible in the system. He told me they were in good hands and well documented. I told him that was good to hear, and I thanked him, and I hung up. I called Megan after that. She picked up on the second ring. "Dad," she said, "what happened on that terrace?" "We had a conversation," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Ryan told me a little. He said his dad came back inside looking like he'd been," she paused, seeming to search for the word, recalibrated. "I just told him a few things," I said. She laughed, short and a little incredulous. "Dad, he's been impossible to rattle for as long as Ryan can remember. Ryan said he's never seen his father apologize to anyone without a lawyer present." I didn't say anything to that. "Were you going to actually follow through?" she asked. "With the files?" I thought about it honestly. "I was going to make a phone call," I said. "I already had." "And?" "The files are in good hands," I said. "Whatever happens with them is the system doing its job. That's all it ever needed to be." She was quiet again. "Then, you didn't have to do that for me." "I know," I said. "I'm a grown woman. I can fight my own battles." "I know that too," I said. "You would have handled it, probably better than I did." "Then why?" I looked out the kitchen window at the maple tree in the backyard. The morning light was coming through the bare branches at a low angle, the way it does in early spring before the leaves come in. "Because I was there," I said. "And you're my daughter. And some things a father just does." She didn't say anything for a while. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly different. "I miss Mom," she said. "Me too," I said. "Every day." We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. Before she hung up, she said, Ryan wants to know if you'd be up for dinner sometime next week. Just the three of us. He wants to talk to you. Tell him yes, I said. Ryan and I had dinner on a Wednesday in early April at a quiet restaurant in Centertown that Megan had recommended. He was quieter than usual that evening, more serious, and I let the conversation find its own pace. We talked about the wedding planning, about the house he and Megan were hoping to buy in Barhaven, about his work and mine. Then he put down his fork and looked at me. My father has never had anyone talk to him the way you apparently did, he said. He hasn't told me exactly what you said, but he's been different. Since the shower, he's been asking my mother questions about how he comes across, about whether he's Ryan. Paused. He's not an easy man, but I think you may have cracked something open. And I don't know exactly how to say this, so I'll just say it directly. Thank you. I looked at him across the table. This young man who looked at my daughter like she was the most interesting person in any room. You don't need to thank me, I said. Just be good to her. I will be, he said. And I believed him. The wedding was 14 months later, a September Saturday, at a Heritage Inn in Merrickville, Ontario. It was a perfect day, cool enough for comfort, warm enough for the outdoor ceremony. The kind of late summer light that makes everything look like it was designed. Megan was radiant. Ryan cried during the vows in a way he clearly hadn't anticipated, and the room found it charming, and Megan reached up and touched his face, and I thought again about Patricia, and decided she would have been perfectly happy. Richard Ashworth gave a toast at the reception. It was brief, and it was gracious, and it was, I'll say this honestly, well done. He spoke about what Ryan had gained, and he looked at Megan when he said it, and what he said was generous and specific and real. He mentioned her work at the clinic. He mentioned the fundraiser she'd organized. He said his family was fortunate to have her. He caught my eye across the room at one point. He raised his glass, just slightly. I raised mine in return. That's all there was to it. I drove home that night, through the autumn dark, the highway quiet, the radio on low. I was tired in the good way, the way you get tired after a day that was exactly what it was supposed to be. I thought about the maple tree in the backyard waiting for me. I thought about Tuesday and Thursday phone calls. I thought about the kind of man I'd watched Ryan choose to be, and about how people can surprise you when something cracks them open far enough to let light in. If there's something I'd want anyone to take from any of this, it's something I've believed for most of my adult life but have never said out loud in quite so many words. Character is not an inheritance. It doesn't come with the square footage of a house, or the balance of an account, or the address of a school attended. It's built slowly, over decades, from the choices made when no one important is watching, the way you treat someone who can't do anything for you, the way you speak about someone when they're not in the room, the way you respond not when things are easy, but precisely when they aren't. My daughter has more character than anyone I've ever had the privilege of knowing. She built it herself. She built it in hospital waiting rooms and clinic hallways, and volunteer shifts and late study nights, and in the particular quiet dignity of a person who has suffered genuinely and come through it without bitterness. She built it without anyone handing it to her, without the tailoring or the wine knowledge or the social expectations that come with a particular kind of family profile. I was a city electrical inspector for 31 years. I spent those years learning to see what was structurally sound and what wasn't, to look past the finishes and the aesthetics, and determine what would hold, what would last, what was actually built to code. My daughter is built to code. She always has been. The rest is just decor.